So, welcome to another episode of Dying in Grace. This is the program where we explore all aspects of living and dying so that we can become more comfortable with the transitions that are all around us and happening to all of us. Especially at this time, we are in the time of COVID, and so we have, an extra focus on how that is impacting us individually. I'm delighted today to have my friend, Mike Polek, who is an extraordinary man and has a lot to share about his own journey and his own awareness about navigating the most challenging path for many of us, which is grief. So welcome, Mike. I'm really happy you're here.
Thank you, Arlene. I'm really happy to be here.
Great. So one of the things that's so fascinating about you is, your earlier journey, at least academically, was very math, computer science, very mind-oriented. And then you came into working with spiritual psychology, and you have kind of really integrated left brain and right brain experiences. And I wondered if you have, how did you come to that place of opening up to another level of way of being?
It's a great question. I would say that it was more, if you look at it from a life perspective, it was a spiritual journey. I was kind of kicked into it. I did computer science and that kind of thing. I lived on the East Coast. And at some point I was basically had to pick up my life. I traveled all the way across the country with, just packed everything in the car. I was going to stay with a friend of a friend for a couple of weeks. I had no job lined up, and it was just take off and go. And my car got totaled after I got here. And so I had to learn new ways of being. I had to learn to live off the charity of others. People reached out to me to assist me, and I just had to learn to integrate just new ways of being. And I look back on it now and I'm going, oh, okay, that was, spirit really coming in and saying, that's all fine. What you've done in the past is great, and there's more here. And the other thing that I would say is, because you talked about, I do have a degree in computer science, and then of course, as you know, I also have a degree in spiritual psychology. They're not that far afield, interestingly enough, because my forte in computer science was as a diagnostician, right? It's how to look at a program or look at the behavior of a computer and go and figure out what's going wrong. How do you debug this thing? In spiritual psychology, that can really be a help, is looking at behaviors and looking at what someone's telling me and sort of fitting puzzle pieces together and being able to say, oh, okay, I can see what's going on. I can see the picture here. It's really fascinating, but my learning there has really helped with what I do in spiritual psychology as well.
I love that. I love how you can take the same skill set and just apply it to something else to humans instead of computers, which probably is a little more challenging. Our programming isn't always come with a manual. And I loved your sojourn across country. I did a similar thing, those proverbial leaps of faith, and came from the East Coast to the West Coast, sort of in the same way, with I wonder what's supposed to happen now type of deal. And the fact that your car got totaled reminds me of the early explorers where the captains burned their ship. So it's like, we're not going back, you have to be here. So good on you for using it as an opportunity to cultivate other aspects of yourself. It's really a beautiful thing. And I think having that balance probably makes it really easy for anyone from any background to work with you on whatever level they seek your services. So, you are an author of a book, I want to get the title right, Healing Through Grief, Finding Freedom Through Depression. Is that right? From depression.
From depression.
Yeah, not through depression, from depression. So let me say that again for people. Healing Through Grief, Finding Freedom from Depression. And I wonder if you could share with us how that book came to be. What was it inside of you and your own experiences that had you put on paper what you wanted to share?
So the seeds of that work are about 20 years old. And I talk in chapter 6 of the book entitled "Why Am I Crying?" That was the first initial, like, okay, I think I have something to say here. There was my first epiphany in the area of grief. In that particular case, I mean, I'd been through the, grandparents and great grandparents and family members passing and those kinds of things. But my first real depthful experience with grief was my first breakup. And because that was, I mean, that really hit home. Like, when a grandparent dies and they're in their 80s, you kind of like, it's the way of the world and that kind of thing. When I was going through my first breakup, I was absolutely devastated and I was in the whole deep depression, just crying uncontrollably for days. And somewhere about the third day, I remember it so clearly. I was walking from, the kitchen area to the bedroom, and I had one thought. Why am I crying over a relationship that I say I don't want? Why am I crying over a relationship that I say I don't want? I broke up with him. In that moment, the waterworks stopped. I mean, I just got it that what I was crying over was not the relationship I had. It was all of the, what was going through my head was all of the, well, if only he would have, or if only I could have, if only we had done this, if only, if only, if only. And I was just spending all this time ruminating over the fantasy relationship of what I had wanted it to be and what I was holding out for. When I got that really clear, I was able to let go of it. And I realized it's been 2.5 years. He's probably not going to change. I kind of know who he is now. I'm probably not going to change. I know who I am. And I just let it go, and it was over, and it was complete, and it was done, and we're still friends. And it just allowed me to let go.
So let me stop you right there, and thank you for sharing that. The one thing I want to say is that one of the beautiful things is while you experience the death kind of grief, it seemed like in the normal trajectory. And what really opened you to understanding grief was the death, if you will, of a relationship, but the person was still there. And I think that's really important, particularly in this time of COVID. I'm just of the opinion that the whole world is grieving on so many levels. And part of that is the loss of all the things that we expected, our fantasies, whether it was the kids who didn't have the senior year or the senior prom, to the Olympians, or, when COVID was first hitting and everything was getting canceled, there was that collective grief besides the fact that people were dying with this mysterious thing. And I don't think that, well, I think that as a society, we really don't know how to deal with grief anyway, but we don't give the full measure of grief to those other kinds of losses, like a loss of a relationship. People kind of want to talk you out of it, like, okay, go, so I just think it's so important that you are calling attention to the fact that grief can come from any kind of loss or accumulation of losses. And so I also love that moment of awareness that came in, where you stopped yourself and said, wait, what, I'm crying over something that I never really had anyway. And oh, that's why I'm really crying. So that's beautiful. So you have written that book, and you've sort of taken on assisting people with their grief in a variety of ways. Do you want to share how you help people work with their own grief?
Sure. Can I just take a moment to jump back? There was one thing you said that I thought was really important.
Sure.
When you talked about, grief can really come from any type of loss. And what I want to say is it's almost definitional that way, right? If you think about it, when we talk about grief, and I just sort of like lay this out a little bit, right? The symptoms of grief and the symptoms of depression are basically identical. The difference between the two is when we talk about it as grief, we know what the loss is, right? It's very specific, it's usually very sharp, and we go, oh, you're grieving because you just had this loss. But what I would say is that what really is going on, and this is a major tenet of the book, is when you have a loss, what happens is you go into this depression. We just call it grief. The way out is the grieving process. And because what happens is what a loss, definitionally speaking, is you have, here's my life going on the way it is, and something happens and something's not there anymore, right? That's a loss. Something's
Right.
not there anymore. So now you're on this other trajectory, this new reality, but the problem is we're still attached to the way I thought it should be. There's this gap that occurs in consciousness. That's what causes the depression, right? It's these two futures I'm trying to reconcile and I can't. So when we talk about, loss leads to this grief or leads to the depression, like, yes, by definition. And I think that's really important for people to understand. So the work that I do with people is about identifying that gap, identifying what is the reality, what is the projected reality or the fantasy future, whatever you want to call that, and getting a real clear look at, and then why do I feel so poorly? Why am I so sad? It's because you have this thing that you're holding in consciousness, these two realities. So I wanted to just talk about that for a sec, because it's like that is one of the keys of this whole thing and the understanding of it. And now I'll answer the question that you actually asked.
No, but I think that's a really important distinction, and that's what we're here to do is share your views about it. And so what I hear, it's almost like what Parker Palmer called the tragic gap between what you thought you were going to have and what you have. And what is also true is sometimes the loss is more subtle and people don't want to name that, or they compare it to other people's losses and then dismiss what they're really feeling.
Yes.
And then by not honoring what's true, that itself can make the depression get worse rather than coming up and out.
Yes. And so if I'm hearing exactly what you're saying is that, there are many, many things. I know someone else who works with couples who are going through divorce. Well, that registers as a loss.
Yeah.
Right? The loss of a marriage. Right. But oftentimes it's like, well, nobody died, so you shouldn't be feeling, people sort of like go, oh, well, that's not, and it's like, and what I hear you saying, which is so true, is the feeling that you feel is the same and it has to be honored. The way that you work with feelings is you honor them, you listen to them, right? And you just be with someone who's in their feelings. And that is the most assistive way that I know of to be with someone while they're going through that. And you wouldn't want to compare it with anyone else's, their experience and the way that they experience it. Or another one is death of a pet. Right? Oftentimes people really downplay that one. And I'm going, that pet is a family member. We call it a pet. It's really their animal. It's their companion. It is a family member. And it doesn't feel any different. And it's so important to still honor what this person is going through.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I actually encourage families, when a pet dies, it's a wonderfully instructive way to teach children about ritual and about honoring. And, whether you're burying the guinea pig in the backyard or even a goldfish, whatever it is, we need to reclaim grief as a transitional process, which in America, other cultures have it, but we are really stilted about this. And my experience in observing people in grief and watching other people try to comfort them is they want to shut down the other person's grief because it makes me uncomfortable. So so we really don't know how to hold space for each other when we're depressed and when we're grieving, and we think we have to do something magic. We don't know what it is, and it makes us antsy. And so we do what we can to make you at least say different words so I feel better. Would you agree with that?
Well, I love what you said about we think we have to do something magic. I would shorten that. The fact that we think we have to do something at all.
Right.
That's sort of the error in approach, right? It's not about what you don't do something when someone is having that depression, having that grieving process. It's how will you be with them?
Right.
There's nothing I need to do. There really isn't, because that experience is so personal. And it's something that everybody has had that experience. right? It's one of the reasons I said, this book I designed to be so accessible because it's a universal experience. The only challenge is when I'm going through the experience, that is mine and no one else can really feels it the same way. And when someone else is going through it, I'm like, oh, I remember going through it, but wow, you're in it. And now I've got to sort of, how do I relate to this? But it really can be, it's just, it's learning how to be instead of to do.
Yeah,
And
which
just,
is the lesson for Western civilization. And I see that with caregiving. I see that with people being at the bedside when somebody is very close to dying. There, people come in and fluff the pillows and open the curtains and do all these things because it's hard. We haven't really taught people how to be present with their own feelings,
yes,
what they're experiencing. And if I can be clear with what's going on for me and work with that, then if I know how to do that for myself, then I know how to be present with you while you're having whatever experience you are having. And I would like to hear, Mike, tell me how that emerges, some of your ideas. How do you get that across? I know you were doing grief workshops. Tell us about them.
so I think that it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago was the first one, and there was only I think four of us, including myself. But it was really sweet, and that was because you asked earlier also about how the book got started, and that was the current seed, which was I recorded the workshop because it was about really talking about these ideas and assisting people in understanding. It's like listening to people and hearing what they had to say and really listening deeply, listening for that and listening for where the loss is and listening for the sadness and those kinds of things, but then also assisting people to understand the concepts in the book. From that, I took that, transcribed it, and was able to sort of, okay, stretch it out and make it puzzle pieces, fit it together into a book form. The second workshop I did, I had planned to do the same thing, but I walked in the room and it was so sweet. Two of the guys were already in tears. And one of them had lost his mother within the last month, and the other one was still grieving his father. And I was like, okay, forget asking people to record this. And there were about a dozen of us. But because we started off at the emotional level, it was just so depthful and so sweet. One of the men who was in there, Rad, his story is in the book, about working with the death of his mother and about what he was holding on to and how he was able to turn that around. So in these workshops, it's also about working with people to looking at not just like, hey, here's the gap, but also what's the attachment to the fantasy, because that or any judgment that's present that's holding that in place. See, oftentimes people, it's like grieving is this thing where it's like, oh, someone dies and you're grieving for a while and you get about a year, sometimes 6 months, whatever, and we think there's a certain amount of time to it and stuff like that. But nobody really talks about like, well, what point did you go from grieving to not grieving? At what point did you complete the process? And people don't talk about that.
Right.
And to me, what has to happen is you have to make the adjustment in consciousness. You let go of that other future and you come into the acceptance of what is and what is now. And it's simply like, this is how it is.
Yeah.
And that's the process that we help people with. And anything that is holding that other future in place, that's what needs to be released. Any judgments that's holding that in place, because that will keep that sadness and despair going.
Right.
It's
Right.
not necessarily an easy process, but it's one that we do. We just don't see how it works most of the time. So that's
Right.
what
Excuse me. I mean, I was going to say, unfortunately, I was just sharing with someone the other day who was at the anniversary of a death of a lost one, 1 year anniversary. And she was saying, well, I've been working through Kubler-Ross's stages, and Kubler-Ross herself said it was never meant to be a linear process. Unfortunately, her concept of trying to look at what we go through, and I would say part of that denial is saying, I'm going to hold on to the fantasy I used to have. I'm going to hang on to that idea. I don't want to look at what's true. And yet it's been so misused over time that people try to put themselves in these boxes and, oh, I got to acceptance, I must be done. And what you so aptly say is there's so many different layers, and there's judgments that come up about even how we're grieving. I've heard people judge the way they're grieving, which only just adds another layer to it. So what have you discovered in working with the clients that you've worked at? Is there a common leverage point that helps them switch, or is there some new insight you've had from working with the various clients you have?
Is there a common leverage point? Not that I've seen. It's very personal. It's very individual, and it is something where, again, depending on what it is, what was lost, it's just so, because again, my work, people who are working with death of a loved one is one thing. Dr. Kubler-Ross, she was actually working, as far as I know, with people who were in the process of dying, like they had a diagnosis that they were going to die. So it was
Hospice,
them grieving hospice. So they were grieving their future life that wasn't going to be, that kind of thing. So it's very personal, it's very individual. I don't know that I can pinpoint a particular thing, and it's not, again, it's just like with me when I said, that my one thought of why am I crying over something that I say I don't want, that was a key for me, but it could be very different for someone else. I do want to talk about, because you talked about the, Dr. Kubler-Ross's stages, and, I call them avoidance behaviors. And the reason that I say that is, right, acceptance is when you're in with reality and it's all good. The other ones, right, whether you're going through bargaining or denial, whatever it is, that is just a way of maintaining that gap in consciousness, right? When I'm doing bargaining, what I'm saying is, I want to change the current reality and make it match my future. The one that I say is I'm going to change the current, and occasionally that works. Occasionally it works, which is kind of weird. Like if you lost a job and then somehow I'm like, no, I'm going to get that job back. And then you do it. And you're like, whoa, bargaining, it worked. But with death, it's a little more difficult. You can't bargain somebody back to life. In denial, it's I'm walking along in my fantasy and I'm going to ignore reality completely. And the longer that goes on, the bigger the gap gets and the farther the depression will go. You listen to people. I was listening to a show the other day and somebody was talking about, I've been depressed my entire life, and 2 sentences later, they're like, yeah, I never got over when my dad left when I was 10. And I'm going like, well, there you go, right? They just identified the loss, but they never did the work to come into acceptance and go, they're like, no, my dad should never have left. And they just refuse to go. And especially for a 10-year-old, I can understand that. But then it's like later in life, you sort of at some point have to come in to go and, 10-year-old will often go, it must have been my fault, and those kinds of things. Just lock that in, and how do you come into a place of going, no, that was just that, that was what he was going through at the time, what your parents were going through, and just accept that you had him for 10 years in the house and now it's not anymore. And to be able to move forward and live with that. And it's like, that's the type of approach. Again, I'm not saying it's easy. And there are sometimes I have people who aren't ready to let go. They're like, nope, I should have been this way.
Yeah.
That's okay. It's not my job. My job is not to convince you to come into acceptance. My job is to show you where the gap is and show you what it is where the feelings of sadness and depression are coming from. It's an educational process.
Yeah. And, I know when I worked in hospice for 8 years, the philosophy was always meet the patient and the family where they are. It's not our job to drag them into reality. And sometimes where they are is where they need to be. And I've seen people deny they were dying while they were taking their last breath, like somehow they were going to get the miracle cure. And like you said, it's people are ready or not, and we have to be gentle with their process. But I think what I hear, and I know what we tried to do, is just offer them opportunities of a new format. And if they're ready, they'll take it. And if they're not, God bless them. And hopefully either at some point they evolve to a readiness, or you have, as the story you told, somebody that's stuck from 10 to wherever they are in adulthood and doesn't even realize, and starts to say, well, depression is my norm. I live every day with this, and it really doesn't have to be that way at all.
Yeah, it becomes the new normal. And it
Yeah.
becomes, it's like when your comfort zone includes the depression, that can be really challenging.
Yeah. So, Mike, I'm wondering, what do you think with the pervasiveness of the kind of levels of grief I talked about with COVID? And certainly we're all dealing with the life we thought we were going to live in 2020, whatever that was, to the big unknown of who knows what tomorrow's going to bring. I mean, I think it's been a real challenge, particularly in the United States, to I can speak for myself. When COVID first hit, I thought, oh, well, okay, by the summer, it'll clear up. I mean, that was kind of my thinking and trying to stay safe. And, here we are, in the fall of 2020 with no end in sight. And so do you see like a collective depression, or what's your view about grief current and the work that will be required when things shift and things go in the direction of more normal? I just don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
So the way that you said that, the direction of more normal, it's like whatever you just called more normal, whatever you're calling normal, that is the how we think this should be.
Right.
Right. And that is still what so many people are. It's like there's so many losses that have occurred, right? Whether it was the loss of a job, the loss of the prom, the loss of, being able to go places and do things, so much loss. And it's funny, the extroverts, serious loss, right? Not being able to be around people where they get the energy from. Introverts, we're like, wait, you want me to stay home, curl up, read a book with my cat? I think I might be okay with that, right? So, it depends on where you're coming from, just how much that, what that loss means to you. So, as long as we hold on, right? So many of us, we're still going on to I thought it's so funny. Last year, I was like, oh, I can't wait for 2020. It's got to get better. I don't know what I was thinking. And yet, what's going on, like right now, it's like people are still holding on to these ideas of when I could just go out to the movies, or I could go out to dinner with a bunch of friends, or I could have that birthday party and those kinds of things, those times. And what we're doing is you're literally taking, here's the thing, right? What we do is we take our memories, the past, and we take them and we put them over in our future. And then there's reality, which is going this way. This is the COVID reality. But I'm still attempting to maintain this future, which is based on what? The past. It's based on my memories. When you get that, if you look at it like, oh, so what you're saying is this is the way life has been up until now. This is COVID, and this is how it is continuing. And if I get into alignment with that, I at least can let go of the sadness and depression and work out, how do I work in the reality of what is instead of trying to fight it? I mean, you can, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, don't, how do I say it? You do your best to try to work with what is and try to, navigate the whole thing. If you want to do that in a fighting way, that's up to you. But there's a certain level of, if I keep clinging to the past, if I keep clinging to things should go back to the way they were, you could end up with a rude awakening.
Sure.
Because we don't
Well,
know.
you're inflicting more pain on yourself. You just keep every day you keep grieving the thing that once was and is not going to happen again. So I get it.
Maintaining a gap,
yeah.
In consciousness. And the way consciousness operates, if you have that gap going, to a greater or lesser degree, you'll experience depression or sadness and those kinds of things.
So, Mike, we're coming close to the end. I wanted to ask you, do you offer your services to individuals in this COVID time? Could people have a session with you? Do you do one-on-one or just group work? Or, how could people be with you and get more from you?
So I don't currently do work with individuals just because I have a day job still. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah.
And I am in the stages of developing workshops in the online format, to try to do it over Zoom and that kind of thing. Because I mean, usually I do a couple of workshops in the summers, and it didn't happen this year.
Right.
And I'm thinking like, wait a minute, I think this work is important. I need to come up with another avenue. So it's in the works, it's in development. And if you want to find out more about it, when it becomes available, you can go to www.michaelpolek.com. That's Michael Polek, MichaelPolek, because you got to spell it right. That's the important thing. And at some point, there'll be a tab for workshops. Right now, it's a one-pager, and the only thing that's on there is, hey, but guess what? The book's available.
Okay, well, that's good. And so that's important if people wanted to get your book. It's also on Amazon, but if they wanted to reach out to you, I guess they could contact you or leave you an email on that list, or no? Yes?
No, yes, they can send me an email. Michael@michaelpolek.com would be the email address associated with that. And the other thing, I also want to say, I did do the audiobook. So, if you're one of those people you don't read, just so you know, I went ahead and did that. You can take it. I think somebody commented, it sounds like curling up, and being all cozy and just listening to me and being like in a little cocoon, so.
Well, Michael, I really appreciate your time and your expertise and your viewpoint. It's been really enlightening. The work you do is really important, and I think more of it will come, and I want to encourage my viewers to check out what Michael has to offer. I know I've read his book, I loved it, and it will enhance your way of dealing with what is. So I just am so grateful, Michael, for your time, and thank you to my viewers, and stay tuned. We'll be posting another Dying in Grace very soon. So thank you again, Michael Polek.
Thank you, Arlene. I appreciate it.
All right.